I used to believe that betrayal had a taste, bitter, metallic, like old pennies left too long in your mouth. But now I know it's not a taste, it's a sensation. A quiet burn behind the ribs, spreading slowly like poison until it owns every part of you. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 39 years old, a senior security analyst for Helix Dynamics, a corporation large enough to shake this country and dirty enough to bury anyone who gets in their way. I used to be proud of that job, used to believe I had everything a man could want, a wife who smiled at me every morning, an upscale apartment overlooking Manhattan, the future that felt safe. Her name is Claire. We'd been married 11 years. 11 years of inside jokes, vacations, fights, reconciliation life. I trusted her so fully that the idea she could hurt me never even crossed my mind, not until the night when everything started to crack. It was a Thursday. I came home later than usual, 9:47 p.m. The digital glow of the clock still burned into my memory. Claire wasn't expecting me. I had told her I'd be working late at HQ, but a system failure fixed faster than expected meant I got to leave early. I wanted to surprise her, maybe bring dinner, open a bottle of wine. Instead, I walked into a quiet apartment. Too quiet. She wasn't in the living room, but her phone was buzzing repeatedly with a message notification. At first, I didn't care. Everyone deserves their privacy. But the screen lit up again and again. Unknown number. Miss you. Can't stop thinking about last night. I froze. It felt like gravity itself shifted, threatening to drag me into the floor. Unknown number again. Same time tomorrow. I need you. My heartbeat became a hammer inside my chest. My hand shook as I unlocked the phone. Yes, I knew her passcode. We never kept secrets. Oh God. Every message was a bullet straight to the skull. Photos, a hotel room, a man's hand on her waist, her smile intimate, wild, a version of her I had never been allowed to see. Hours I thought she spent at yoga, with friends, at meetings. She wasn't healing herself. She was destroying me. My legs nearly gave out. The bathroom door opened. Ethan? She stepped out with a towel in her hair. Why are you home so early? She saw the phone in my hands. Her face changed. Fear first, then anger, then something worse, cold calculation. Give that to me, she demanded. I didn't move. Who is he? I managed to whisper. How long? She wrapped her arms around herself, like she was the victim in this moment. You weren't supposed to see that. Not I'm sorry. Not let me explain. Just I got caught. Something inside me shattered so violently I swear the sound was audible. I love you, she added, robotic ally. But we're broken, Ethan. You work too much. We don't talk anymore. I needed him. Her silence was confirmation. I packed a bag that night. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't hit walls. I simply walked away because if I stayed, whatever was left of me would die. I spent days in a hotel, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything but the images burned into my mind. I stared at the ceiling, counting every mistake I'd made. Every moment I didn't notice that she stopped loving me. But anger grows like a virus. And once it takes root, it doesn't want peace. 3 days later, I returned to work. My colleagues didn't notice the change in me, but someone did. Marcus Hale, head of internal investigations. Sharp eyes, cruel smile. A man who enjoys poking at wounds. You look like death, Cole, he said, leaning on my cubicle wall. Marriage troubles. I wanted to punch him. Instead, I shrugged. He smirked, lowering his voice. Well, if you ever want to make a problem disappear, you know the department I run. I thought he was joking. But then he slid a card onto my desk. We solve personal issues too. That night I drank until the world blurred. Claire sent messages, calls, begging to talk. I ignored every one. Revenge. That was the only word that made sense anymore. But revenge requires clarity, planning, patience. When I finally sobered up enough to think, I did the only logical thing. I followed her. She left our apartment at 7:02 p.m. Dressed to kill, makeup flawless. Red dress I hadn't seen in years. She got into a ride share and headed downtown. I stayed back just far enough not to be noticed. The ride ended at the Argenta Hotel, known for discretion, a place for powerful people to indulge in forbidden things. I recognized it from the photos. I watched her meet a man in the lobby, tall, expensive suit, confident in a way and never was. He touched her lower back as they entered the elevator. The doors closed up. My chest burned like fire. I sat in my car, breathing like a man being suffocated, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't go after them. Not yet. Instead, I waited. And while waiting, I stared at the glowing windows above one lit square where my wife was betraying everything we ever built. When she finally came back out, hours later, she was laughing, like she hadn't just murdered our marriage. She kissed him goodbye. A soft, unhurried kiss. Then she walked away. I followed him. He got into a high-end black sedan. License plate. Each 9-2. I wrote down every digit. I tailed him until he reached a gated residence uptown. A guard waved him through. Whoever he wasn't just some fling. He was someone powerful. Someone dangerous. Someone I would have to destroy carefully. By the time I returned to my hotel room, a new emotion had settled in. Cold, focused. If she could lie that perfectly, what else was she hiding? And suddenly, this wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was bigger, darker, like I had just kicked the door to a secret world I was never meant to see. I opened her messages again, scrolling further than before, and found the first clue that would change everything. A bank transfer. Large amounts, regular. But the recipient wasn't a name. It was a corporation. A subsidiary of Helix Dynamics. My company. My wife was involved in something that could get people killed. And now I wasn't just a betrayed husband. I was a man with a mission. Because if she thought she could ruin my life and walk away laughing, she didn't know me at all. Revenge wasn't going to be loud. It would be a quiet, methodical dismantling of everything she cares about. I would become the ghost in the walls of her life, watching, waiting. Building the perfect trap. And when it finally sprung, she'd wish infidelity was her worst crime. You don't plan revenge the way amateurs do in roaring fits of anger, with brandished threats and runway confessions. You build it like a house you'll never live in. Foundation first, hidden reinforcements next, then windows that only open the way you want. If the house collapses, you want it to collapse on them. I had one advantage and one handicap. Advantage: my day job at Helix Dynamics gave me access to tools, logs, and people who assumed I was one of their own. Handicap: the web I was about to pull apart ran through my professional life. Every keystroke I made inside a corporate terminal could be traced, audited, used against me. I would need to be smarter than I'd ever been. Step 1. Inventory. I mapped Claire's world the way I'd mapped a penetration test. People, places, permissions. I built a spreadsheet that read like an interrogation. Phone numbers, last known locations, friends, payments, and a new column I labeled exposure value. Each line had a number from 1 to 10, how much a particular detail would humiliate, hurt, or ruin her if it became public. Personal texts were high value. A flirtatious photo, high. A single bank transfer routed through a shell account, catastrophic. The transfer to a Helix subsidiary changed everything. It told me this affair had an institutional spine. Helix was my employer. If someone inside our family of companies was funneling cash to a woman who met powerful men in hotel elevators, that was a thread that could unravel a lot. But it was also a dangerous thread to tug alone. Damage to the company could bring investigators who don't care about motives. The law is not sentimental. So I started with smaller, safer things. I rewatched the hotel footage, security camera captures I'd memorized from 1,000 investigations. The man Claire met was careful, no face on camera angles, late night arrivals, strategic lighting. But he made 2 mistakes. The first was a wrist tattoo, partial letters, a script I could trace. The second was a phone call he made in the lobby that he believed was private. Short, whispered, but not private enough for a man who thinks he's invisible. I took a frame-by-frame export, brightened shadows, and fed those images into my private facial recognition cluster cold box in a server room under my apartment that ran only at odd hours and under random MAC addresses. It spat back a name I'd hoped would be wrong: Adrian Vale, CEO Vale Capital, board member, Helix subsidiaries, trustee on private foundations, a man who liked anonymity in bed and names in the papers. If that was true, then Claire wasn't just an affair. She was a channel. I had to verify it beyond a shadow. The truth I wanted had to be undeniable, elastic proof, and registrable. I needed receipts, physical things, not just pixels. So I built a 3-stream operation. Streama, close surveillance. Samir, my old ghost from the surveillance world, agreed to work for me again, cash only, off format. She used a tail she trusted and a motorcycle that never showed up on CCTV because its plates were false, and its operator was a champion at sitting in situations where eyes are blind. She followed Adrian Vale from the hotel to a townhouse uptown and recorded his comings and goings for 3 days. The footage showed Valerie Claire's name and the registrar entering the townhouse on Monday nights. Enough for pattern. Stream B, financial forensics. I had credentials from my day job that included access to inter-subsidiary routing tables, thin slices of metadata the company keeps to monitor payment health. I wrote a query that looked like a script I'd been running for months: anomaly detection on recurring transfers. It returned the same oddity: the Helix subsidiary account that, on several dates, pushed funds to a shell entity with the innocuous name Marlin Associates. Those transactions correlated with the nights Claire was at the hotel and the nights she was at Vale's townhouse. Transaction times, IP logs from the subsidiary's user sessions, and employee badge swipes formed the neat Venn diagram. Someone inside Helix had executed the transfers, and the badge swipe history showed one person with access at 3:12 a.m. on one of those nights. Stream C, human intelligence. Cold files can be compelling, but people fold in ways paper never does. I went back to the concierge who checked Vale into the Argent. He'd been discreet until I paid him a retainer, and 3 evenings of story about a fictitious client who needed discretion for life or death reasons. The concierge, flattered, produced a signed ledger and a handwritten note that Vale had used the name S. Lark as an alias for bookings. S. Lark, an invented name with the soft sound of a woman. Soft until you realize that aliases are maps too. Armed with these 3 streams, I could lay out a mosaic that would hurt in the exact places I chose. But I didn't act immediately. Patience is a muscle you need to flex. Revelation is most effective when the victim can watch the world turn against them and think at first it's an accident. Then it becomes unmistakably targeted. I started with Claire's professional life. Not viciously yet. I leaked a photo to a small design blog that used stolen metadata to show she'd been in a hotel suite linked to Vale. The blog, hungry for any narrative of glamour and infidelity, published with a coy headline. Her phone lit up with messages from coworkers, some accusatory, some concerned. Word travels faster in offices than in courtrooms. Claire's social circle frayed. She called me once, voice brittle, begging for help. I pretended I didn't hear it. Next, I exposed the transaction trail. I compiled a terse, precise packet, screenshots of the subsidiary's transfers, timestamped badge logs that showed access during odd hours, and a copy of the concierge note linking Vale to an alias. I dropped it anonymously into the inbox of a finance reporter who owed me. He liked stories that could make trustees sweat. The piece he published the next week was clinical, no slander, only documents. It hit the markets, then the boardrooms. Helix's stock took a micro-dip. Board members on the finance side called emergency meetings. People who benefited from opaque systems do not like public audit. That ought to have been the end of it. Reputation damage, quiet settlements, an exit for Claire, and my clean revenge. Instead, It bent into something stranger. Adrian Vale was not a foolish man. When the story ran, he did not vanish, he moved. He hired security firms whose existence is whispered about in the kind of rooms I'd once patrolled. He also did something more dangerous. He began to surveil me back. The first counterstroke was elegant and clinical. A message slid under the door of my apartment. A plain printout of my surveillance spreadsheet with one line circled exposure value. Tenant and address? No signature. A challenge. The first time someone does that, it is a warning. The second time, it is a gain. I escalated by misdirection. I fed Vale a narrative I wanted him to believe. That the money was going to a fake charity. That the transfers were routed through an internet helix I'd suspected years ago. He believed it enough to pull his resources toward that intern. They raided a storage unit, found nothing. And in that frantic hour he made careless mistakes. A security lieutenant used an unencrypted phone to call a fixer, and Samira picked up enough of the call to triangulate a lead. Errors happen when men feel cornered. Errors are gifts when you know how to read them. That gift led me to a man in a suit who calls himself a fixer but whose ethics have the flexibility of an elastic band. He told me for a price that Vale had a reputation for cleaning certain situations with surgical teams, men who remove threats quietly. He called them stabilizers. The word had a modern, corporate ring to it, but I knew what it meant. It meant Gideon Vosses, muscle wrapped in paperwork. Now the stakes rose. I adjusted accordingly. I moved part of my operation into analog. Digital trails are tempting and often damning, but they're also traceable. So I used the old tricks. Burn phones, dead drops, multiple intermediaries. I recruited a woman, Lena, an ex-Helix procurement officer who'd left in a blaze of bureaucracy and low morals. She knew where shell companies registered, which lawyers would sign off on phony invoices, and how to craft a paper trail that reads like legitimacy. She also had a soft spot for men who promised to right the wrongs that had eaten her conscience alive. Her fee was less money than it was vengeance. Together, Lena and I created a dossier that could not be dismissed as rumor. It included copies of invoices, notarized receipts I'd had altered to show a recipient, and a timeline that marched like an unshakable drum. I fed the dossier to an investigator at the Securities Bureau quietly, by hand. Bureaucracies are lumbering things, but once a file slides into the right hands, the inertia can be unstoppable. The Bureau opened a quiet probe. They called Helix's compliance unit and asked for explanations in tones that implied subpoenas without using the word. Helix tightened, management circled, and the senior executives who'd once scoffed at rumors began to schedule meetings in secure rooms. Meanwhile, Claire's world collapsed inward. Her agency performed internal audits of her accounts. Colleagues stopped inviting her to lunches. She stopped calling me. When she did email, it was to demand I stop humiliating her, stop ruining her life. She didn't realize that the life she had was built on whispers and thin incentives, and that the same whispers used to feed it could be redirected into a blade. But I didn't want to merely ruin Claire. I wanted her to understand the architecture of betrayal, that she wasn't just a woman who wanted attention, that she'd been recruited into a project that made people like Vale powerful. So I left evidence small enough to be found but large enough to be undeniable. A printout of the transfer schedule tucked into a book she kept on her shelf. A photograph left on her dressing table that showed Vale's wrist tattoo in clearer light. An email I forwarded to her boss with the subject line, "Please explain these transactions. People ask me if what I did hurt me as much as it hurt them. The answer is complicated. Revenge is not a salve. It sharpens a man. It teaches him patterns. It hollowed me out in places I didn't know were full." And then the first real wave of danger arrived. 2 blocks from my apartment, someone tried to force my car off the road. It was sloppy, a dent in the passenger door, tires shredded. An attempt that screamed of muscle, hired fast and angry. No one was seriously injured. The message was clear: back off or suffer consequences. I didn't back off. Instead, I let the consequence function as a sign that I was effective. If men were moving against me, it meant my moves hurt. The Bureau's quiet probe continued. Vale's security grew clumsy in their haste. Meridian-like fixtures circulated rumors about the investigator who'd brought the dossier. The narrative splintered in ways I could exploit. Each defensive effort made a new error. But everything had a price. My phone had to be changed. My company credentials had to be used less and with more disguise. I started sleeping in a different place every third night. I stopped relying on familiar cafes. I started to write in a journal, a small analog ledger I kept under my mattress, where I documented every contact, every hint, every time I felt watched. It was my way of grounding. It was also my fallback if everything else burned. At the end of 2 weeks, I had what I wanted, a quiet federal probe, a set of physical receipts linking Helix's subsidiary to Marlin Associates, and a trail that led from Claire's hotel nights to Vale's townhouse and into the inner sanctum of a man whose wealth bought him absence and influence. But I also had a clearer understanding of the danger. Gideon Voss was still out there, and Vale had enough money to buy the right silence. Men like Vale don't forgive. They recoup. They will take what they need to make you stop. The house went up another floor. I added locks that required drills to open, and cameras that recorded locally and nowhere else. I trained Samira to come earlier and stay later. I taught Lena to fake outrage and grief for the cameras when we needed witnesses. We prepared contingencies that read like war plans, and then, one night, the phone in the hotel room lit up, and no number, no caller ID. The voice was not Vale's, but closer, colder. "Ethan Cole," the voice said. "We're impressed you've managed to find so much. Impressive, dangerous. We'd advise you stop. Let sleeping things lie. And maybe your wife keeps what dignity she has left." I studied the voice, tasted its edges, heard a man who believed he was safe repeating the words of men who had seen the world and moved through it without consequence. "Who is this?" I asked. There was a pause like a blade being sharpened. "You know the names, Mr. Cole. You know the faces who pay for discretion. We have our eyes on you now. Stop, or your life becomes a ledger too." They hung up. The call was a break in the quiet, but I had already broken quiet weeks ago. I'd turned on a light. The problem now was that red skies required faster action than months of patience. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the window, watching the reflection of city lights, planning the next floor of the house. I knew one thing: to win, I needed to move from reactive to proactive. The net I'd pulled was far larger than an affair. It reached into boardrooms and into bank vaults, and into the hands of men who do not scare easily. So I did what men do when they have nothing left to lose, and a skill set built on stealth. I readied the trap that would make them show themselves. I would bait Adrian Vale and Truhin, the men above, with a token they could not resist. I would make the bait look like a vulnerability, and watch every predator circle closer. I would make them prove their reach, and in doing that, expose their limits. It was obscene, and it was terrifying. But revenge has a geometry. You can measure the angles, and if you're careful, predict the fall. I set the bait, knowing part of me might not survive the net when it closed. That's the thing about building a house to fall on someone. Sometimes you miscalculate, and the roof caves in on you too. If I didn't try, if I let them keep their house and their tools, then the last thing they would have ever taken from me would be my silence. I turned the page of my notebook and wrote one phrase in thick black ink: "Make them show their hands." Patience had always been my weapon. Precision had always been my virtue. But by the time the bait was set, patience had become a vice too costly to maintain. The call to thin, polite threat had shifted the tempo. Men with money had eyes, and men with influence had hands. If I was going to force them to show both, I needed to be smarter than the eyes and quieter than the hands. The bait was simple on paper and intricate in execution. Make Vale believe there was a weakness in his offshore routing, a vulnerability that an outsider could exploit for control. Let him move resources and people to cover it, then watch the choreography. A man with enemies will always reveal his partners when he tries to fix a leak. The partners are the prize. Lena did the forgery. She could make a ledger look like the work of a drunken accountant or the perfect signature of an overworked lawyer. She forged a contract that suggested Marlin Associates had been used, but the payments had a new tag, Risk Mitigation Consult. It was what you write when you want to launder intent. I put the forged pages in an envelope and had a courier accidentally drop it in a mailbox tied to one of Vale's junior assistants, someone small enough to panic and large enough to be noticed. Samira positioned herself 3 blocks from Vale's townhouse on a bike with plates that didn't exist. She called in at intervals under the pretense of a delivery driver doing a route. Her feed was meager and first shadowed passersby, a dog walker, the gloved hand of a cleaner, but patience stacked information into pattern, a black SUV arriving at odd hours, a courier with a crate that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and secrecy, enough to keep my focus. Meanwhile, the Bureau's quiet probe had begun to hum like a hive. They were slow. Bureaucracies are built to be slow, but they were thorough. My anonymous drop had made them curious. Their auditors tapped in ways that hammered the ledger's edges until something gave a routing number that bore the signature of a mid-level compliance officer at Helix, a man named Simon Ree. He had approved a series of operational transfers while on a business trip to Zurich. That match could ruin a man's career. It could also, if mishandled, point investigators to me. I had to be careful. The Bureau was a tool and a threat. Use it. And you invite their light into every corner. They could protect me or burn me. That's why Ephraim was my insurance. He whispered the right words to the right investigator to make sure the probe moved but never blinked on me. He fed the Bureau things in a way that forced them to use their own seals. The night I knew the bait had been swallowed, my apartment smelled of burned coffee and late winter. I'd left a decor ledger an obvious clumsy forgery on a commuter bench near Vale's office with a note. If you're smart, you'll fix this quietly. It was an invitation to tip the scales. Men who think they can by discretion rarely resist the vivid temptation of doing so. Vale couldn't resist. He moved his stabilizers in ways that left tracks. He reassigned a senior compliance officer overnight. He sent Gideon's monogrammed car to a cluster of safe houses. He asked old friends to make calls, and crucially, his assistant panicked and placed one of his calls on speaker, where a contractor in a surveillance van picked up enough of a phrase to let Samira triangulate a location, a storage facility in Jersey, Unit 17B. I slept in windows at night listening for footsteps, but my phone stayed silent. At 3 a.m. Samira texted, 17B, make move. I tasted iron at the back of my throat and told her to wait. We needed evidence that could stand in court or in a paper. We needed a confession or a physical piece of the puzzle. Breaking into a storage unit gets you a box of dirty linen. Catching a courier on camera handling a crate with cereals tied to her or a hardware gets you a story and a man. We moved at dawn. The unit was less dramatic than the movies pretend. A double-locked roller, a neon keypad, a single crack of sunlight through a grated window. Samira called me once we were in soft. A whisper with the smile I could hear. He's here. The courier, young, scarred knuckles, moved the crate like it was nothing, but his phone buzzed the whole time. Messages from a number with a Meridian prefix. He opened the crate. Inside, a set of no-drawer-like hardware, configured for remote uplinks, stamped with supplier serials that matched a batch I'd seen in the warehouse raid. Samira filmed everything. I watched from a block away, my hands surprisingly steady. The courier closed the crate and left. The footage was grainy but comprehensive. His hands, the supplier logo, the waypoint stickers. We had movement. when I played the clip quiet in Lena's kitchen at noon. She sat in the dark and mumbled a word that sounded like prayer and curse. "He's deeper in it than we thought," she said. "This isn't about favors. This is infrastructure. Infrastructure." The word slid through me like a blade. This was not just payments to a woman for secrecy. This was a private pipeline. Corporate citizens play at patriotism and stability while they build private networks that can reroute reality. Control of that layer is control of everything. Vale wasn't paying for sex. He was paying for access. Claire was not a mistress. In the ordinary sense, she was an operator, a key holder, or simply a recruit used to give cover to an operation that needed plausible deniability. The human cost didn't register on balance sheets until someone like me started making the numbers public. We had enough to force Vale's hand, but not enough to drag the men above him into the light. We needed a nexus, someone who would step on the cable hard enough that the people who owned the cables would flinch. That someone, I decided, would be Adrian Vale himself. Make him angry enough to overreach and he'll reveal his sponsors. So we provoked him. I leaked a single, small file to his inner circle, the kind of file that looks like a patch note in an engineering environment. It was crafted to look like a request for an urgent remote uplink scheduled for a municipal node, something Vale couldn't deny because authority makes men obedient to their own power. The request included a phantom token, the kind used to authorize hardware swaps. I flagged that token in a way that only someone with clearance would notice. Vale answered. He sent a fixer with explicit instructions: retrieve the token, deploy it to the node at 2 a.m. and run the test. Gideon was assigned the job. Gideon. When his name hit my feed, my lungs tightened. My careful house of evidence, my spreadsheet, my security cameras, everything the chessboard I'd been building had a piece called the muscle. Gideon's appearances always complicated things. He was not a man who could be managed with legal pressure. He was a man who feared exposure less than impotence. He had little interest in paper. He lived in the currency of silence enforced. We positioned Samira and 2 others near the designated node, an old subway switchbox by the waterfront that served as an access hub for a string of municipal sensors. If Gideon came to hand over a token, we would catch him on video. If he tried to force an access, we would have footage of him on the node with physical hardware. This is the moment men with muscle miscalculate. They trust brute force more than they fear cameras. 2 a.m. came hard and cold. The Hudson smelled of oil and iron. The switchbox waited in a puddle of pooled light. A delivery truck idled on the opposite curb. For an hour, nothing. Tension felt like static on the skin. Then the black sedan eased to the curb. Gideon moved across the road like a shadow. He wore the kind of coat that eats light. He approached the switchbox with a small, black case that matched my worst expectations. Samira's camera zoomed tight. Hands moved. Gideon worked quickly. A practice motion against the panel. A sequence of tokens slid, a torch flaring in his palm. The case clicked. He withdrew a small device and tapped it onto the console. It should have been a clean, quiet job. Instead, he triggered a mic behind the panel. Our rig, and the sound recorded his breath, heavy and close. The clicking of his tools, the soft buzz of a phone in his pocket. Samira's drone hovered above, capturing the sedan's plate as it eased away. We had his flow, then chaos. A shadowed man in a suit crossed the street. 2 of them and approached Gideon with hands raised in a gesture of greeting. The conversation was brief, low voices, gestures. Gideon handed over a small envelope. The suit nodded. Gideon turned to leave. That small exchange was everything. The suits were Meridian men. They wore cufflinks with a faint, abstract tone. They spoke with the cadence of privilege and the smell of contracts. One drove the sedan. The other left a trace. A coffee cup with a loyalty sticker I could read in the grainy footage once I enhanced it. That sticker tied to a chain of cafes across the city with contracts that Meridian used for front Deliveries? The breadcrumbs were messy and perfect. I watched the footage and felt a cold pulse in my throat. We had the courier, we had Gideon, we had an end cufflink, we had a coffee sticker. But we also had a problem. Gideon didn't make mistakes for long. 2 nights later, someone tried to smash Samira's surveillance rig with a crowbar. They missed by inches. The metal frame bent, the camera survived. The message was obvious: move slower, or the next miss will be your skull. Panic would have been acceptable. I didn't panic. Panic is for men who have something to lose in ordinary ways. I had something to lose in very specific ways. The life I had, the anonymity I'd preserved at work, the people who trusted me. But I also had next steps. I fed the footage of the exchange to Danvers with strict instructions. Anonymize the images, keep faces blurred, but publish the pattern: the cufflink, the courier, the coffee sticker. Danvers struck a peculiarly cruel balance. He ran an op-ed-style piece that read more like a forensic essay than a scoop. It landed like a pebble in a swan ripples, not a tidal wave, but it did its work. The public doesn't always care about nuance, but markets and trustees do. Meridian's donors issued private inquiries. The board trembled, and Gideon's men fumed. The pressure came not as headline fury, but as a cascade of private obligations. Men like Fairfax made calls. Men like Mercer demanded explanations. Meridian shifted resources to covert channels and made a tactical retreat in favor of plausible deniability. And then Vail reacted like a man who had just been bitten. He overreached. 2 days after Danvers' piece, Vail called a closed meeting at an elite club uptown, the kind of place where lawyers and trustees tuck their mistakes under the napkin. He ordered Gideon to settle the problem by retrieving a file from a private locker in a downtown legal firm. Gideon grunted acceptance. That was the opening I'd been looking for. I had Samira tail the courier to the locker, watch the locker open, film the hand slipping the envelope in, and record the license plate of the sedan that later took it away. We had artifacts now: a handoff, a locker ID, a consignee's signature that matched signatures on older Meridian files. The locker's CCTV was wiped within 90 minutes. Someone at the firm had access, but our external footage survived. The next morning, when the locker's records were subpoenaed in a quiet process the Bureau had started, it led to a name that would have huge teeth to bite: Aidan Mercer, a procurement manager with ties to Meridian, and a shell trail that pointed to Fairfax's lawyers. That copy of the ledger, if pushed hard enough, could crack the spine of the network. That day, my email filled with threats thinly veiled as advice. Keep the world small, Ethan. That's all you ask. The sense of being hunted went from fog to perimeter. My dog stopped sleeping near the door and instead chose the hallway, a sentinel. I told myself I wanted justice. I told myself I wasn't like them. I told myself the damage I would do would be surgical. All that was still true in one way. I wanted them to feel the collapse of everything they'd built. But another truth burrowed. Whenever you force a system to show its hidden seams, you teach it how to be quieter, smarter, more careful. Meridian had a scar now. They would hide differently. They would become harder to pull apart. By the time night fell on the week the locker handoff was traced, Gideon was quieter. He didn't show up at the bar. Danvers stayed out of his comfort zone. Samira slept with a phone beside her bed and an old pistol she'd promised me she'd never use. Lena packed a bag: legal documents, false IDs, a number I could call from anywhere. Ephraim secured an OCE code, one that set a file into an inspector general's hands if anything happened to me. We had momentum. But momentum is a bridge built of the bones of error. You cross with care. The Bureau's probe had teeth now. It asked for interviews, for logs, for audit trails. Helix caved a little. Someone in compliance, Simon Ree, was put on administrative leave. Vale's name became a whisper in corporate halls. Little things shifted. And Claire called me once in the middle of that week, her voice thin and earnest. You can stop. Ethan, please, you don't have to become them. She asked the question I had asked myself in front of the mirror. Who am I if not the man I was? For a second I felt the old restraint, the man who wanted a quiet life of predictable work. Then Gideon's image flashed behind my eyelids, his scar, his hands, and I remembered what I had seen in the hotel lobby and what the ledger said about the subsidiary. I can't stop, I said. Not yet. She hung up. There were consequences. A man cannot be half in a war and expect his home to remain intact. That night, I found a single Polaroid on my doorstep. Gideon sitting with the senator I'd seen in a background clip months ago, the man who'd accepted a donation from Fairfax, smiling like a man at a banquet. The back of the Polaroid read in familiar, deliberate script, "We see you. We will not forget." It was a warning. It was a promise. It was a postcard from the edge of the world I'd poked. I'd burned the Polaroid. The flame ate the paper in a little flare and left a smear of black ash. It didn't make me feel anything but colder. That was the thing about getting into someone else's equation. You pick up their variables. You calculate for their cruelty. They calculate back. But we weren't finished. The locker file, the courier footage, Gideon on camera, those things moved the needle. They made men shift the way tectonic plates shift, small, almost imperceptible, until the building cracks. Meridian would adapt. Fairfax would bury. The senator would denounce rumor. But a leak had been created. Water always finds a way through stone. And when water finds a seam, it widens it. I slept in fits that week, the city's noise an uneasy lullaby. And in the quiet of dawn I let myself imagine a world where the loom was torn down completely. Then I looked at the ledger, the watchman's scars, the Polaroid, and the list of names we'd gathered, and realized the more realistic ending. We win some, we lose some. And some things you break can never be made exactly as they were. The net had tightened. Gideon had tripped. Vale had moved. Meridian's boardroom had started to sweat. The Inspector General's office had a file. And I, this man who used to sleep with a lighter in his hand, had a ledger of enemies and allies and a taste for plans that no fortune could take away. If the third act is where monsters reveal themselves, then I had hit the part of the play where the masks come off. I'd seen the hands. Now I needed the faces behind them. The net had been set. All I needed now was to pull. They say you don't know what you're willing to lose until the world demands payment. You don't realize how much of yourself is built from ordinary comforts until someone threatens them one by one. The city, which had once felt like a grid I could decode, turned into a hunting ground. My routines were the map they used to find me. The ledger I'd compiled was suddenly a ledger of debts I'd accrued, debts I might not be able to pay. When Gideon's Polaroid arrived at my door, the first thing I did was not burn it. I scanned it, enhanced the pixels until the grain honed down into detail, and then I put it back in the envelope like an offering. Warnings are most effective when they arrive in paper. They leave trails. They feel personal. The message, "We see you, we will not forget," was not bravado. It was the currency of men who enforce silence. By the time I woke the next morning, Meridian had shifted from a rumor to an operation. Board members were nervous. Fairfax's name was a whisper in the right parking garages. The bureau had stepped softly, like a giant testing ice. The public churned with a handful of pieces Danvers had seeded. The pattern of transfers, the courier footage, the cufflink in a blurry frame. The market trembled in ways that didn't make headlines. That was the most dangerous part, the quiet collapse of trust among those who fund the machinery. Those collapses can be surgical and silent, exactly the kind of death they preferred. We moved like quick animals through that silence. Lena burned through contracts and signatures, tracing the path from Marlin Associates to Meridian to a legal shell in the Caymans. Samira kept Gideon on a leash of sight enough to know where he slept, the places he ate, the time he favored when he walked the dog. Danvers kept printing soft pieces that made trustees itch in a way no one could drown out with PR. Ephraim took meetings with the right bureaucrats and left them with files that smelled like Trouble. Then Meridian answered. It wasn't a threat so much as an accretion of pressure. Small things. My bank card declined at a corner store. An anonymous delivery left a black stone of coal on my desk. My work laptop briefly locked me out of remote access with a short, clean message. Security compromise, contact IT. It sounds like theater. But it's the way men with resources turn everyday life into a chessboard. They take the things you use and make them suddenly untrustworthy. First violent thing that felt personal happened at dusk. I was walking Samira's route with a coffee when a sedan cut across my path and a door opened. Two men got out, one broad-shouldered, one thin, and before I could step aside, the broad one put a hand on my shoulder. He smelled like old tobacco and oil. He leaned in close enough for me to feel his breath. "You're making a lot of noise, Mr. Cole," he said. "Noise makes clients nervous. You've got the wrong man." I lied, the reflex of a man taught to protect the truth that mattered. The thin one moved his lips near my ear and produced a business card. "No name, just a number." "Stop." He smiled, small and tidy, like a man who has dinner reservations he doesn't intend to miss. They left before I could name them. The message was clear. "Curb your appetite, or we will invent a hunger you cannot survive." That night, I sat in a closet and called Claire. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was thin, practiced for pleading. "They came to my office today," she said. "Someone left a note in my folder. Stop, or we will write the next chapter for you." "I don't know who they mean." She paused. "Ethan, please stop." The loop she wanted felt honest. The loop I needed to close felt like survival. I lied again, softly this time. "I'll slow it. I promise." I did not keep that promise. I couldn't. The Bureau's probe gave me leverage and a deadline. They had authorized a quiet subpoena. They wanted a meeting with Vale's assistant and with a Helix compliance officer named Simon Rhee. Rhee's authorization stamp was the crack in the concrete. If he'd signed those memos while traveling for work, he'd left fingerprints that could not be explained away by corporate bluster. We'd planned a sting. Ephraim's old friend in the Bureau arranged for a supervised meeting. My anonymous dossier would be used as the predicate for a compliance interview, and Samira would be in the lobby with a camera. Lena would deliver a Fox follow-up memo to a locker in the city where Vale's people had been known to deposit notes. Danvers would ignite interest with a teaser line in a column. The idea was to force the actors to show their faces, and when they did, capture the exchange on film and on record. The day of the sting, I dressed in neutral black and walked into Helix's glass tower with a badge I borrowed from an old vendor contact. It felt obscene to brief office air, as if nothing had happened. Chairs spun gently at reception. Men and women with coffee cups discussed quarterly targets. The world went on indifferent. I sat in a car near the entrance while Samira watched Vale's townhouse and the courier routes. Ephraim sat in an armchair in a neutral room, fingers steepled, watching security cameras with a man who had the authority to sign off on a subpoena. Lena fed an envelope into a locker server that didn't know it was handing off a decoy. We had precision. We had faith in the tools we'd built. We had a hole the size of a hand in our plan, because Dominion moves in numbers, and men enough to put a body between a ledger and a reporter. Something detached and unquantifiable. Courage. And courage is often the enemy of gold. Gideon did not come to the locker. He sent a man with fewer scars and an attachment to punctuality. The courier followed procedure. The locker opened. The envelope handed over was indeed a decoy. The man left. We breathed. We thought the dance had gone our way. Then, in the quiet hum of a cafe 2 blocks away, Samira whispered into my earpiece, "They're coming for you. Vehicle at East Alley. Plate masked." Her voice was a calm bell. The camera on Vale's townhouse window showed 2 men in black moving with the silent grace of professionals. I moved up. By the time I reached the alley, the vehicle was already there. 4 men, quick and efficient, exited and moved toward me with practiced steps. My heart did what hearts do when calculus becomes combat. I could run, I could fight, or I could do what I'd always done. Use leverage. As they closed, I looped my arm, pulled free a small canister of pepper spray, and aimed for the thin-faced man's eyes. He went down with a curse, and the others hesitated, an error that can be fatal in a designed strike. Samir's bike cut her from across the street, rode in like a courier, and collided with the shoulder of one man, toppling in. I ran. We scattered, and the men caught nothing but a silhouette and a memory. The van peeled off into the night. I made it home with a bruised elbow and the echo of a breathy, white knuckle fear in my throat. Someone had tried to take me that night and failed. They would succeed more quietly next time if I invited them in. By hesitating, we escalated in response. Samira moved her mother out of her apartment and into a safe house. Lena left town on a business trip, fake, but necessary. Danvers ran a follow-up piece that mentioned in passing the ring of service providers who had been paid by Meridian no-names. Just a pattern. Ephraim had meetings with contacts who promised protective custody for a week. Thin protection. But protection. And then the worst thing happened. They took Samire. It was the kind of thing that happens not with fanfare, but with terrifying efficiency. She'd been at a low-profile cafe, taking a break, when two men in suits, posh, polite, sat beside her. One offered her a cigarette, the other a business card. She took both politely. Then she excused herself. An hour later, she didn't come home. Her phone pinged once with a message I'll never forget, a photo of her apartment door, the lock forced, the safe draped open. Below it, a single line. We will not tolerate your misdirection. Return what you took, or lose what you love. They left no bodies. They left a space and a presence that gnawed like acid. We searched. Lena called contacts and hired people to look. Ephraim moved mountains and got a list of precincts to canvass. Meridian went publicly quiet. Gotham-style men do not like the fuss of disappearance. They prefer brokering quiet and making noise go away with paperwork. But Samira was gone for 48 hours. No proof of life, no ransom call, just the smell of stale smoke and the taste of bad coffee in our mouths. I rode the wave of panic like a man steering a boat in a storm, making decisions that felt like sieves and hoping something would filter through. On the third morning, the phone rang. An unknown number, static. Then her voice, thin, tired, brittle like paper. You have to stop, Samira said. They're not men who leave much to chance. They made me a favor I can't repay. I felt every sane instinct try to speak, negotiate, trade, pull back, give them what they want. But the ledger I'd built birthed an economy. Debt called for currency. Samira couldn't go back to the life she'd had. Her family now had a target. I felt that like a stinging, hot wind. Who? I asked. A pause. Samira's voice, soft and compressed. Gideon. And the people who pay in. They're bigger than Vale. You pulled a thread the wrong length. I remembered the calm, precise voice on the anonymous call that told me to stop. I remembered the Polaroid. I remembered the senator in the background of a photograph and the way men with ties smiled like predators. I'd promised to get her back. The next week was a blur of construction and destruction. We pulled every lever we could. Danvers started to push on Fairfax's trustees. Hard, quiet conversations in private rooms hinted at consequences that could make fortunes crumble. Ephraim used legal pressure in offices that smelt like polished wood and bad decisions. Lena produced documents that suggested Meridian's shell companies had been used to fund political monotony donations that coincided suspiciously with votes in municipal councils. And I planned something that felt more monstrous than anything I'd ever engineered. If Gideon was the muscle and Fairfax the sponsor, I had only one place left to land the fall, their pride. Men like Fairfax don't do well with scandal. They have reputations swaddled by charities and endowments. If I could make those reputations fracture in rooms where trustees sat with fiduciary fears, the scaffold that held Meridian might wobble. We carved a path. Danvers prepared an investigative feature timed with a committee meeting in Zurich where Fairfax's name was on the agenda. Ephraim leaked just enough that what followed would be considered a prudent, not panic, move. Lena manufactured a small, believable crisis and irregularity in a charitable grant, one that would call Fairfax in and shine a light into his filings. The day of that meeting, Meridian's boardroom felt thin. Trustees in linen suits shuffled papers, while private eyes in the back of the room made notes. The paper trail we'd fed them had the right balance of headaches and threats. Comments about reputational exposure went around the table like a bottle. Fairfax did not crumble. He moved like a man whose life has been lived in secure rooms with secure calls. He rehearsed the right sigh and the right look of wounded innocence. His hands were steady, but the chips fell anyway. One of his trustees withdrew a multi-million-dollar pledge by the end of the meeting. Another, embarrassed and prickly, issued a private inquiry to his legal counsel. Sometimes winning is about math, not morality. A single major donor pulling support is a domino. 2 is a crack. 3 is a fracture. But the victory bled into loss. Samira returned 2 days after the Zurich hearing. She was alive, shaken, and wiser in a way that made her younger in spirit and older in bone. She refused to speak about what had been done to her in any detail, and that refusal was an accusation in itself. She had lines across her wrists where cuffs had been tight. She had a look in her eye that said some doors, once opened, will not close the same way again. Her return was complicated by the fact that while Fairfax's world had trembled, someone else, someone more resourceful and more patient, began to nudge the game board in a new direction. Meridian didn't die. It restructured. Lawyers rerouted funds. Ghost accounts shifted addresses. Trust managers called in favors. Men moved money like smoke. We snatch at it and find our hands empty. And then, the blow I felt in my chest as if it were physical. Lena was arrested. It was petty. In legal terms, falsifying corporate documents. Identity fraud in connection with procurement. The kind of crime they pin on people who cannot fight back with money. Her arrest was neat and surgical. She called me from a call box with a voice that had a rawness I'd never heard. "They've got paper," she said. "They planted a trail. They made it trace back to me. They had the ability to make a problem look like a mistake of a smaller player, and so they did." Meridian's lawyers loosed a set of small, mean beasts into the judicial system, and Lena, who had no shield of wealth, got caught in the jaws. I could have called Ephraim and had the probe pivot. I could have brought in legal pressure, money, bribes, favors, the dirty toolkit of men who survived systems like this. I did all of it and ended up paying a price. Lena was freed on technicality the first week, but the court case dragged on. She left the city under an assumed name and a track of fear. She promised, with a hand on my face, that she'd disappear, and that if I survived this she would return. The ledger of loss was growing. People I'd pulled into this Samira, Lena, Danvers, Ephraim had paid costs in sleep, freedom, blood, and fear. They had done it out of loyalty and a desire for a clean result. I had promised them a path to justice and instead had given them a journey through fire. There's a kind of cruelty to this work that I didn't anticipate. You learn that in the exact moment you see the faces of the people you've used and realize how much of yourself you've weaponized against them. I saw it on Lena's face in the police station, in Samira's hollow smile when she returned, in Danvers' quiet anger when his piece ran and he watched a nameless courier get picked up by Meridian's men before he could get the full scoop. I had miscalculated the collateral. By the end of the month, the public knew enough to make boardroom chairs squeak, and Meridian had curtailed some of its most audacious moves. They lay low. Fairfax's staff patched leaks. Gideon vanished into the kind of shadow you need a search warrant to find. But the victory was Pyrrhic. We had exposed a section of the loom, and one of the men we loved, Lena, had nearly disappeared into the law's hungry maw. Samira had returned changed. Danvers had enemies. Ephraim's promotions were frozen by a whisper campaign. Claire had been put on leave at work, and me. I had more enemies in more places than I knew how to count. The net tightened not because they were better at hunting but because the system I'd poked had learned what to fear. They adapted. They moved shells. They made life difficult. They made love fraught with danger. One night, in a hotel where the windows offered a view of a city that looked like glass teeth, I opened a bottle and thought about all the things I'd wanted when I started. Closure, truth, a clean undoing. I had them in a sense, but they were not what I had imagined. I had ruined a man's career, exposed a network, made men accountable in small ways. But I had also bruised people who had trusted me and taught a network how to be quieter. The truth settled like a stone. If I wanted to finish it clean, it would require the kind of sacrifice I had swallowed in hours of sleepless plotting. The final cuts would have to be surgical, yes, but also brutal. They would need to hurt enough to remove the bedrock beneath Meridian so that it could not stand, and they would need to be public enough to make trustees tremble. That would mean a final exposure so decisive that Fairfax could not quietly move his assets, Gideon could not vanish, and Vale could not tuck his problems under a velvet napkin. I put the bottle down and wrote a single plan in my notebook. It was not pretty. It required access to Helix's internal control plane. It required me to log into a terminal and perform actions that would look like sabotage. It required sacrifice at a scale I hadn't yet fully imagined. And it required one other thing I did not like asking for, Claire. I found her at a coffee shop under gray sky. She looked smaller than she had when we'd walked into apartments and built ordinary lives. She looked like everyone else in this game, marked by knives. Do you want to be complicit? I asked her, blunt as a surgeon. Do you want to help fix what you helped break? Her eyes filled with something, shame maybe, or the shadow of a soldier preparing for a last mission. I didn't know what I was doing, she said. I thought I was safe. I thought I could play both sides. Can you still help? I pressed. She nodded. Yes. There are bargains you make that are not noble. There are decisions you make when you have nothing left, and you are prepared to throw your life into the center to pull something else out. She'd offered herself as a source once before. Now she would be baked. We agreed on terms. She would have immunity on the condition she became a witness to the scale of the scheme. She would feed us details about Vale's schedule, his locks, what he trusted and what he feared. She would get lists of names and dates, enough for Ephraim to build the final case. In return, I promised to keep the Bureau as the mechanism for any public unmasking. It felt mercenary. It felt necessary. It felt like the kind of thing I had promised I would never be. So we finalized the plan. It would be ugly. It would be dangerous. It would not be clean. And when the net finally fell, whether it would break the loom or simply teach it to hide better, I could not say. The last thing I did that night was tuck my notebook under my pillow and sleep with my phone in my hand. The world hummed like a city about to be severed. The ledger of losses stretched long, the list of allies who had paid dearly in ending. If the final act demanded a price, I'd pay it. If it demanded more than I had, then the world would have its answer. I had tried. And that, for now, was the only honesty left to me, an ugly, resolute truth that meant I had to become the thing I despised to stop it, or die knowing I had not tried at all.